All right, so we're recording. So is there any questions before I jump into my notes about the reading in general or anything that came up in your breakout rooms that you would like me to address? All right, no worries. So we'll move through this. We'll jump into our fishbowl, and then we'll open a group conversation. Cool. So a few things that are on the table for me of importance. One is this idea of political accountability, right? So in the sense that you could jockey or for somebody or you could put your vote behind somebody, but Malcolm is attended to the fact of how do you ensure that once those individuals are in office, the platform that they ran their campaign on and the promises that they make to garner your votes are going to be fulfilled, right? So to me, that's a implicit theme running through the speech. He also makes the claim that the Republicans and the Democrats are on two sides of the same coin, right? So we know in America we operate with a two-party system. By and large, those two parties are the Republicans and the Democrats. But as it pertains to Black folks in America, as Malcolm claims, right, um, those two entities work in the same way in regards to not addressing the grievances of Black pain and suffering. So if we think back to the lecture we had on Baldwin, and I mentioned Baldwin's pillars of white supremacy or Baldwin's pillars of white inferiority, I said they were the white imagination and the maintenance of white innocence. So for me, Malcolm has a pillar as well, and not more so in a framework of systems of oppression, but Malcolm's pillars are really driven by one being truth, right? And you hear that in the speech. He tells you, I'm going to tell you the truth whether you like it or not. Those who are familiar with Malcolm's autobiography, those who are familiar with the movie, truth caused Malcolm to shift and pivot positions, right? So when you first when you're reading the autobiography, they start off telling the story of his childhood, and then he evolves to this individual, Detroit Red, who is a hustler, who is a pimp, right? Sells drugs. He gets put in jail, and he's presented with the truth. And I'll put that truth in air quotes of the Nation of Islam, right? And once he digests that information, he digests that truth. He pivots his life and becomes the minister Malcolm X. While in the Nation of Islam, he comes across some information about Elijah Muhammad, who is the leader of the Nation of Islam, and his deeds, and his misdeeds, and his immoral behavior with women within the Nation of Islam. So, because of that truth that he was confronted with, he's forced to pivot and kind of separate from the Nation of Islam. During his separation, he took his Hajj, his pilgrimage back to Mecca. While he was in Mecca, and he says this very famously and very notoriously in his autobiography, and is echoed in the movie that Spike Lee did. When he went to Mecca, he seen brothers of Islam who had pale skin and blue eyes, right? So he knew at that point the truth that the Nation of Islam presented about Islam, about Orthodox Islam, was inaccurate, right? Because one of the fundamental components of the Nation of Islam's version of Islam is that no pale skinned individual could be able to make it to Mecca, right? But when Malcolm went to Mecca, he seen that that's not the truth. So it made him pivot and readjust the way that he looked at and analyzed this religion of Islam. In fact, a lot of his time spent in Mecca was him relearning the practices of Orthodox Islam, right? And you see him shift and pivot towards those practices because, again, that's a truth that he had to be responsible to. So for me, one of the pillars of Malcolm X, a guiding star for Malcolm X, is this idea of truth, right? Um, Also, you hear within the speech a collective notion of freedom. So Malcolm is just not worried about his freedom. Malcolm is not just worried about the freedom of Africans within the United States or Africans within the Caribbean. He's looking at a collective notion of freedom. Also within the speech, I have I just sense this notion of a apocalyptic prophecy. What do you guys think I mean when I say an apocalyptic prophecy, and how do you hear that playing out in the speech that's given by Malcolm? Another way to think about it, what is the apocalypse? What does that symbolize? The end of the world. Absolutely, right? So if this is an apocalyptic prophecy, right? Malcolm is saying if America does not atone for its wrongs, it could be the end of the American idea as we know it, right? And you hear that within the title of the speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. Um, so kind of going back to my me talking about the pillar of Malcolm X and what that being truth, and the truth that he had to come to terms with understanding how the Nation of Islam misrepresents Orthodox Islam. To be responsible to that truth, Malcolm created the organization entitled Muslim Mosque Incorporated, right? And the objective of that organization was to bring the Orthodox Islamic practices to the United States, to New York, so that way those who've been indoctrinated with the Nation of Islam's version of Islam would have exposure to Orthodox Islam, right? So you also hear in the speech, he wants to draw a separation between religion and politics, right? And he says that, if I come to you saying that I'm a Muslim and you're a Christian, we're already at odds. So we can't organize, we can't come together because our religion is separating us, right? So we leave your religion at home, keep that in the closet. That's a personal relationship between you and God, right? We're here to organize around Black nationalism. So in lieu of that, right, he's created the Muslim Mosque Incorporated for the religious purposes, and then he establishes the Organization of Afro-American Unity for the purpose of the political organizing, right? So not only, is he articulating this idea of the separation between politics and religion, he's putting this idea into practice by having two separate organizations that will address religion and address politics. And then he also hears in the speech Malcolm's attentiveness to global happenings, right, as it pertains to the colonial state. And he talks about all the colonized entities who are overthrowing their colonizing masters, right? He talks about Vietnam. He talks about Kenya. He talks about all these people of color throughout the world overthrowing the imperial powers. So you kind of get a sense of his international analysis. And I think really one of the biggest takeaways for me, for Malcolm, especially in his later part of his life, is the shift from civil rights struggle to a human rights struggle. And one of his major tasks was to take the United States to the world courts for human rights violation against African people, right? And to me, that's very fecund and that's very profound. And I would have to assert that this is something that our contemporary, or really anyone after Malcolm, has not really took this task seriously, right? Because if you think about what a civil rights issue is, right? The civil rights issue is not being able to live where you want to live, not being able to eat where you want to eat, not being able to go to school where you want to go to school, right? But what Malcolm is talking about is this is not really, yeah, that's a problem, right? But the bigger problem is your human rights. So if we think about the term, and just work with me for a moment here, we're going to separate the organization of Black Lives Matter and the movement of Black Lives Matter from the claim, from the terminology, from the speech of Black Lives Matter, right? What does that term mean and symbolize, right? Somebody tell me, what does Black Lives Matter mean?
uh, Equality and equity for all, because they've made it a big point that all lives don't matter until Black Lives Matter, but they also always bring in other people of color, and their injustices and oppression as well.
Correct. And implicitly, right, if you have to say that Black Lives Matter, that means by default they don't, right? Because if they mattered, you wouldn't even need to make the claim that they matter. So when you're talking about life, that's not a civil rights issue, right? That's a human rights issue. This is a claim to allow me to live my life in a way that other segments of this community are able to live theirs, right? So this is not a civil rights problem. That's a human rights problem. So what we see a lot of is people who are engaged in contemporary struggles are stuck in the civil rights trope, right? So they do the same things that the civil rights movement were doing, right? The marches, the rallies, trying to take things to the court system, right? Trying to find justice in the court systems, right? But Malcolm is saying we have to have a bigger vision than just that, right? We have to be attentive to that. This is a issue that's been going on paper, right, since 1619. And I just say on paper because that's when they say it's officially took place, right? We know it goes back further than that. So how could you be dealing with this since 1619 and not realize that this is a larger human rights issue? These are larger human rights violations, right? And then he also makes the claim that you can't take the criminal to the criminal's courts. So if we know anything about the prison industrial complex and the profitization of the prison system, we know that the courts are instrumental in the maintenance of the system, right? The prison industrial complex would not work without the courts being intricately involved, right? They have to hand out the sentence, they have to hand out the bail amounts, etc., right? So how could you really expect that when you have a situation like Derek Chauvin, which is an anomaly, right? How could you really expect to get justice in these court systems, right? I read a statistic. They say since 2005, I want to believe, there's been 8 officers convicted of murder of unarmed black folks or just people of culture, period, right? People, period, really. Let's just like keep it what it is. Like anybody who's been unarmed and been killed by police, there's only been 8 convictions. Within that time until now, there's been over 1,000 murders per year, right? So if we're looking at those numbers, you can't say that we're finding justice within these court systems. And this is what Malcolm's kind of calling our attention to. So if we're not getting that justice there, we have to go higher up, right? You got to speak to the manager, right? Who is the boss of them courts, right? And go to that next tier up. And this is what he's trying to get us to think about with the human rights issue. And he says very plainly, the government has failed you, right? Anytime that you're marching in 1964 singing that we shall overcome, that's a government failure, right? And he says it very plain, very plain. And I think he ends the note on I'll end with 2 points. There's a shift in Malcolm. And again, think about the truth that he comes to terms with. Early in his career, while under the Nation of Islam, he talks very despairingly against those who advocate for integration, most notably Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, right? But in this speech, we hear him say, I will no longer speak bad against the integrationists. I now realize that we have the same objective, right? Our objective is freedom. The difference is I see separation as a means for freedom while they see integration as a means for freedom. As long as your objective is freedom, I'm willing to get behind you and get on board with you. And that's a drastic shift to the way that Malcolm was thinking prior to leaving the Nation of Islam. And then finally, and in the tradition of a lot of the great Black radical thinkers, towards the later end of his years, he ends his life with a Pan-African ideology, right? And towards the end of the speech, he says that they're going around in Africa and saying that the state of the Black folks in America is okay. It's not as bad as things seem to be, right? Or they're going around in Africa and trying to create divisions between Africans on the continent and Africans here in the United States, right? But I'm going to go to Africa and tell them that that's not the case. I'm going to go to Africa and let them know that we're your long lost brothers over here. And if you read his autobiography, while he's in Africa, while he's on his pilgrimage, that's what he's dedicated to doing. Even through the language barriers, he finds ways to articulate the plight of Black folks here within the Americas and build bonds across the Atlantic that will fortify this notion of a Pan-Africanism. So that's what I have for the notes. We will jump into our fishbowl. Next week for sure, I will send out okay, I got you, Jeremy. I will send out a email detailing where you guys are at with your fish bowls. So that way you'll know if you're done for the semester or if you have one more to do. Keep in mind, next week will be our last time of lecturing. So you will have to, if you haven't done your fish bowls, next week will be the time to do it. So we have one volunteer. Give me 1 second, let me write it down so I have my notes in order. Group B. Okay, we have Jeremy. Does anyone else want to volunteer for the fishbowl?
I'll go for it.
I'm sorry, who said that?
Me, George.
George. Okay, got you, George. Thank you, man. Anyone else want to volunteer?
I'll go too.
And Jasmine. All right, perfect. I'm good here. If anybody else wants to volunteer, we could add one more. All right, bet. We'll go with Jermaine, Jeremy, excuse me, George, and Jasmine. So whoever wants to start it off, it's on you.
I guess I'll go. I was thinking about when he was talking about the separation of religion and politics. Um, it reminded me a lot of what's going on today with the white supremacists and the insurrection, and how there is an intense Republican Christian mesh, uh, which I thought was interesting. Like his whole speech could easily be said today for so many different reasons. Like also when he was talking about like the cops who aren't helping segregation are technically breaking the law, and it reminds me of like the street sweeps that were happening in Echo Park, where the police are making sure that the land is being secured and getting rid of all of the unhoused people there. So yeah, it was just a lot of it was like, this is still stuff that is happening today politically. Like also with the Dixiecrats, kind of reminded me of Kamala Harris, even though I know she's not from the South, but just her political ideology and the way that has supported the cops and the laws that she's passed in the past are very much the same as Republicans would have done as well.
Yeah.
I'd like to add on to that. So me and my group similarly discussed what he was saying about religion and how we should keep religion out of this argument. And I think what really made that point very very powerful is what question number 2 says, the distinctions I found between reading and hearing the speech. Because when I was hearing the speech for the first time, I really felt the power in his voice and the demand and the inflections, and that is very distinguished as compared to like when I was reading it. Because when I was reading it, I could kind of feel what he was saying like through the diction he was using, and I kind of got his tone from it. But when you're listening to it, you really feel his words.
Yeah, good point, George. One thing I wanted to kind of pick on, with, excuse me, what Jeremy said in regards to Kamala Harris, because it's a really brilliant point, and for me, I that was a very strong point of frustration for me as I'm watching the whole political thing take place and the campaign take place, and I'm watching, especially Africans in America, how they respond and how they just rally behind her without any critical analysis. And I'm like, yo, has any of you guys researched her political history? Has anybody researched her who she's locked up? She is very prone on locking up people for marijuana convictions, right? Um, Very prone on locking people up who are non-violent offenders. So it didn't make sense to me how you could, on one hand, say defund the police, and then on another hand, throw your vote behind Kamala Harris, right? Like I couldn't reconcile that contradiction. And in the speech, Malcolm says, black folks, we're politically immature, and that is a great reflection of the political immaturity, because if you can't see that as a contradiction, then I don't know what we're doing here, right? And then even if we're going to operate under the premise of, well, she's a black woman who will be in the office, right? We could go down that right if you so choose. But her from her own mouth tells you, I'm not going to do nothing for black folks, right? This is what she says. So how can you say that, yeah, we're going to support her and give her vote because she's one of us, when she's telling you I ain't gonna do that, right? So a part of it is like, man, is Malcolm so brilliant that he can see the future? Is the state so stubborn that they're not willing to change? Or are we, especially as African people here in America, so disavowed to the truth that we just repeat the same things over and over and over, right? And these are some things that, like, just reading this, analyzing what's going on, I try to make sense of in my head. But Jasmine, I know you said you wanted to contribute as well.
Yeah, so I completely agree that like when reading it, that you can't really like feel like tone that he's speaking in, but in the video, you can really like feel his like how like powerful and like what he's talking about. And also, and with my group that we mentioned that we talked about the speech is like a bit more formal,
Mm-hmm.
and in the video he kind of like added some humor too with what he was talking about. And when you read the speech, you can't really like know that it would be like funny until you watch the video and listen to the video. And one part that I found that was funny was when he mentioned that I don't see any American dream and I see an American nightmare. That kind of like stood out to me when I was listening to the video as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jasmine. Like that's something for me that Malcolm doesn't really get a lot of credit for. He's always presented as very serious, very stoic, which he was, right? But also humorous. Like he's funny as hell to me, at least, right? Like with his ability to play on words, right? Tricky Dicky, right? Like that's cleverness that just doesn't you can't account for. Another thing that Jasmine kind of makes me think about is the role of the audience in hearing the speech, right? Because to Jasmine's point, he drops a joke, but you don't really know it's a joke reading it until you hear everybody in the audience laugh, right? And the laughter is so robust, he has to kind of put his speech on hold to let them kind of get themselves together and continue, right? So I think the audience adds a very powerful implicit layer to the effective response of hearing the speech juxtaposed to reading the speech. Thank you guys. That was a really spot on and poignant fishbowl. I think you guys, everybody touched on some really, really good points. Let's open it up to a larger class conversation with the last 20 minutes. We could talk about what we brought up in the breakout rooms. We could talk about anything mentioned in the fishbowl, or just what's your thoughts on the speech as a whole.
I'm so glad that he said we should keep religion out of like human rights at this moment because it's not going to solve anything. Because I am so sick and tired of seeing so many of like those kinds of Christians on my Instagram saying like, "Oh, you got sick because you didn't pray hard enough," and then I'm sitting here like, "Oh my God, please shut the hell up." Because I'm Catholic myself, and I'm like, "Oh my God, they're gonna think that we all act like this," and I'm gonna like jump off a roof.
Yeah. It's just for me, one of the things is very dogmatic, right? And it doesn't lead towards critical thinking, right? Especially like, and I can't speak for other religions just because I came up in a Christian home, and that's the religion that I know the most before I walked away from organized religion. And it's not really about questioning what the preacher says, what's in the Bible, right? You can't question the authority figures, and to me, that's never a good practice, right? Like if you claim this to be truth, truth with a capital T, then it should be able to withstand critique and it should be able to withstand questions, right? That's how you know truth is truth because you have to test it out, right? That's what gives science such validity is because it's a tested and a proven practice of science, right? So I'm always suspicious and leery when it gets into spaces that you can't be critical, right? That's why even in my classroom, I tell y'all like, hey, don't take my word for it. Look it up. You know, go on Google and see if I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, let me know. We could discuss further. I'm not the authority figure on information, right? Um, so I definitely agree with you, Jana. Who else? What did you guys think about the articulation of Black nationalism? How did that make you feel when you first heard him used the term, and then as you articulated it, it shift the way that you thought about it. And the reason I asked this, right, because in our now, when you hear nationalism, it typically has like a negative connotation, but the way that Malcolm is talking about it to me is not in the way that we are taught to or socialized to understand nationalism in our now.
When he got to the economics part of like the idea of black nationalism, he said he even says like it's pretty simple. You guys should just support black businesses and not give in to the hands of the white capitalists. And I'm like, hell yeah. And then I kind of thought of, and then he also brought up the point of like, okay, so if a black owned business cannot move into a white neighborhood, then how come white people get to trample on our land? And then I sat there and I'm like, oh my god, he's calling out Starbucks. I was thinking, there like, oh my god, he's calling out those big expensive apartments that nobody can literally rent. He's basically calling out the ideas of gentrification. Yeah. And I feel like if he were here right now and he sees like Starbucks in like poorer areas, oh god, he would be pissed. Yeah. Like he would be so pissed.
You're absolutely right, Jenna. And I think it's even more insidious than gentrification, right? Because even if we take a step back and we go to the 1990s and you think about the Rodney King situation. I know it's like, I don't even know if some of y'all was even born, or if you were born, you were very young. One of the tensions at play there were the black residents who would go into these corner stores and the treatments that they would receive from the owners of the corner stores who were not black, right? And this is something that Malcolm is talking about also, right? So you get this notion of the black dollar circulating within the black community. And they say in 2021, it doesn't stay within the black community longer than 24 hours. And this is how this process plays out, right? You get your paycheck from however you get your pay, right? And then you need to go buy groceries. So you go to the store and buy groceries. Typically, where you buy those groceries are not black owned, right? I think in LA, there's one black owned grocery store in, well, actually two. There's one in Inglewood and there's one in Watts. It's called Grocery Outlet, right? So if you're not going to Grocery Outlet, you're going to Albertsons, you're going to Vons, you're going to Ralph's, you're going to the corner stores, right, where you're getting subpar produce, right? But those entities aren't owned by black folks. So automatically when you go buy groceries, you took the dollar out of the black community, right? You go buy your clothing. Typically you're not going to black owned clothing businesses, Gucci, all these other high-end stores that we like to frequent so often, right? That's again, taking the money with outside of the black community. So not only is it about how we are spending the money, right? It's about creating ownership. So that way, when the money is spent, there's ways that we could be able to spend that money within our community. So you're absolutely right in talking about gentrification, but he says this is a problem even before gentrification comes into place, right? This is something that happens even before you get Starbucks in your area. The corner store is exploiting you, right? And then you have the phenomenon, especially in the 60s, when they would say, don't purchase anything where you won't be hired, right? So they would set up these organizations and set up these businesses, and I'm gonna say in the hood, in the black areas, right? But they wouldn't allow black folks to work in those areas. So what is the contradiction that you could take my money, but you don't feel comfortable with me being in your store as a worker, right? So these are some of the things that Malcolm is also picking up on. Who else?
This also makes me think of how they're able to come and input like stories, but at the same time there's easily can take them out. Like recently they closed a rouse in a Jewish community that needs it, and they don't have one that's close. And they also closed one in South Central, and that's a colored community. Yeah. And they're like, oh, because they're not making enough profit, and so they closed them. But people that actually go to the store, like, this is the only one that I have close. I'm gonna have to go further, and like I have to transport through the bus, and I'm like,
yeah. When I used to live in Inglewood, I'm trying to think. There was two stores in Inglewood grocery stores. There's a Ralph's and a Vons. And then if you were to go like to Crenshaw, there was a Ralph's that they had shut down because they were building the trains. And then they had a Albertsons that had got shut down also because they were building the trains. So for me, this speaks to this idea of food deserts. I don't know if you guys have heard of that term, but it's just areas that there's not accessible healthy foods, right? And if you would count the amount of fast food restaurants just opposed to actual grocery stores where you could buy fresh produce, the disparity is really ridiculous, right? So this is another way that marginalized communities are being oppressed by not having healthy eating. And then they say that, diabetes and things of this nature, high blood pressure, hypertension, they're hereditary things within the Black community. And for me, nah, I wouldn't go as far as to say that, right? It's passing down bad food habits, right? It's not having access to healthy foods. It's not having the knowledge to know what foods are healthy and things of that nature. So yeah, I think you guys are all really hitting on the head in the subtleties, in the subtle ways that systemic racism can impact, communities. Good point. Who else?
I've actually seen a documentary on food deserts and how it's affecting communities of color in like Washington D.C., New Orleans, here in California, and like in places like Compton. Like we're seeing a lot more fast food restaurants open up, as well as more dialysis centers opening up, while there's less and less access to fresh food in areas like that. And it's only contributing further to the American obesity problem as well.
Yeah, and it's funny because like when you really start to understand how the body works, like you don't like medicines and all that stuff. You just need to know what to eat, right? And go out and get sun. Like everything is really already provided for us, but because of capitalism, right? The culture of capitalism, everything becomes monetized, right? So instead of getting natural medicines, we have things that you could take that the those who created these medicines are profiting off of, right? So it's just interesting how the tenacity of capitalism, that nothing is safe from it, right? Everything is going to be centered around the desire to accumulate profit, right? From your food, from your healthcare, from your education, right? Everything is predicated on that. Can you speak on that a little bit more, Esmeralda? What you put in the chat?
Well, every the US, well, like pretty much based off on like the food desert, instead of trying to prevent people from getting sick, they rather and giving them access to healthy foods, they would rather let them get sick and try to treat them to make money off of it instead of actually trying to help them and preventing the actual illnesses.
Yep. It healthy people don't pay, essentially is what the premise is, right? Like if you're healthy, I can't make money off of you. So it would behoove us to allow you to get sick so I could sell you the cure, right? To me, this is no different than the mob. Like I don't know if y'all watch mafia movies, right? It's like, yo, it's a shame that something would happen to your business. Why don't you hire me for your protection, right? But who's gonna come and fuck up your business? The mob, right? So it's to me, it's the same type of premise. It's a racket, right? It's a racketeer type of engagement. Who else has some thoughts about the difference between hearing the speech and the difference between reading the speech? Nobody else thought hearing the speech was a little bit more impactful, or just opposed to reading it?
I thought that the hearing the speech was more impactful since you're able to feel the emotions more. And like I guess in the written speech he provides a lot more examples, but while in the actual I feel like in the his actual speech he um turns away from using all of them and emphasizes more on some of them.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. Because like also we have to understand that the written speech, right, is an edited version of the speech that was given. So it's really on how whoever transcribed the speech interpreted what was being said. So it kind of allows some things to get effaced or left out. Um, but kind of going back to this idea of the crowd's role in the experience of this in experiencing the speech being heard. Um, has anybody heard of the term call and response? So I don't know if y'all have ever been to a black church or a Baptist church. You hear this constantly in the church, right? Um, the preacher will ask, "Can I get an amen?" And the congregation would respond with "Amen," right? You hear this in the speech that we heard from Malcolm, right? You hear the crowd saying, "Right on, brother." You hear the claps, you hear the laughter, right? This is this notion of call and response. Where you may have experienced this is in a concert, right? The DJ oftentimes is the conduit for this call and response. And what that may look like is the DJ dropping the music out, right? And the artist, instead of singing the lyrics, they put the microphone to the crowd and they expect you to sing the lyrics or rap the lyrics, right? This is this notion or this idea of call and response, right? It's an engagement between the performer and the audience, between the preacher and the congregation, right? Between the professor and the class, right? It allows the performer to know that those who he's performing or she is performing for are engaged, right? It's part of the reason why I asked to have you guys turn on your camera, so that way, even if you don't say anything, you may nod your head, and I can see that okay, what I'm saying is making sense, it's resonating, or you may have a inquisitive look on your face, and I know I might need to clarify this a little bit more, right? This is all built within this idea of call and response that is just really about a connection to those who you're speaking to. And it's about those who are hearing the message, letting you know that what you're speaking on is resonating with them. So this is a very fundamental part of Black literary tradition, of Black oratory tradition, and really Black radical tradition as a whole is the engagement with the audience, the engagement from a pedagogical standpoint, right? The engagement with the students in the course in the classroom and what have you. What else? Let's hear from two more people who we haven't heard from, and then we'll call it a day.
So for me, when I was like able to read through it, it was like I really read in a monotone voice. It's just that's just how I do it. But I was still able to get how like powerful it is from just the reading. And then when I was able to hear him and like hear him speak, I kind of put all that emotion back and thought back to the reading, and I was like, yeah, like it was way more powerful like hearing it.
Kimberly, did you read it out loud when you read it, or did you read it to yourself?
I read it to myself usually.
Yeah, just as you guys can kind of continue your academic career, play with reading out loud and reading to yourself. Um, and the reason being, like, especially like poetry, that's something that you would probably want to read out loud because the spacing and the punctuations and like the white space between letters and words, they become really more important, right? The poet may write those pauses for auditory response, right? So just play with what you read out loud and what you read to yourself. And really, reading out loud is going to make you a better reader because you have to be attentive to all the subtleties in the text. Let's get one more who we have not heard from.
I thought the speech was very impactful, especially when he stated how the Black community was not part of the Americans, but rather affected by the American system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kenneth, you brought up a good point. Thank you for bringing it to my attention because I typically we go into this when I give this lecture. So I don't know if you guys noticed throughout the whole semester, I have not used the term African American, right? At best, I use the term Africans in America. Why do you guys think that is?
Because they're not considered American.
Yeah,
It's like excluded, I guess.
yeah. And I'll use the metaphor that Malcolm most famously uses himself, right? If everybody in this class is at a table and everybody's eating lunch, right? And then I pull up to the table, but I don't have a plate. I don't have no food on my plate. I'm just sitting at the table. Am I eating lunch? Nah, right? So, in other words, I'm here within this country called America, but for me to vote, I had to organize, I had to fight, I had to die, I had to bleed, right? For us to get an education, we had to organize, we had to fight, we had to die, we had to bleed. For us to get housing, we had to fight, we had to die, we had to bleed, right? So while we're here, we have not received the benefits, the privileges, or the rights that a citizen of America has received, right? And even when we have been received those rights, it's through a lot of organizing, a lot of fighting, a lot of bleeding, right? So we have to fight for the privileges that are automatically afforded to some other aspects of this country, right? So in Malcolm's assessment, just because you're here don't make you American, right? Americans have constitutional rights. They have legislative privileges, right? And none of those things African people have. So how could you consider yourself an African American or even an American for that matter, right? He said, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. Hell, I'm not even American, right? I'm a victim of America. So to me, it doesn't make sense to ascribe or attach yourself to this notion of being American. And really, if you really want to get down to it, I would question all people who consider themselves American. Do you really want to be an American, right? Like, what does that entail? What does it require for those who come from other countries, right, and migrate here to pick up this notion of patriotism, to pick up this notion of Americanism, right? Is that a notion that you want to pick up, right? Because to me, when you pick up this notion of Americanism, it's an elitist mentality, right? It's an exclusive mentality to where not everyone gets to be included into that, right? And that's part of the American identity is being able to exclude others from that identity, right? So and that's why I pose the question like, is that what you truly want to identify with, right? Do you want to be this hyper materialistic, individualistic entity that is willing to erode the environment, erode the universe for your self gain, right? These are components of being American, right? It's the components of being Western. It's the components of being a agent of modernity, right? Looking at the chat, yeah, it's to me. So I always pose the question, right? What is American culture? Somebody describe for me American culture. I feel y'all. I don't know either. I can't. What's American food? Only thing I can think about is like hot dogs and hamburgers, right? Um, Sports, maybe baseball, football. That's American culture, right? But what I do know for sure is damn sure it's part of American culture is what Jenna put in the chat, right? Americans know how to be racist. They perfected that shit, right? Like they perfected it so well that the Nazis were studying what America was doing. They perfected it so well that when South Africa was trying to establish the apartheid state, they were being attentive to um, what America was doing in establishing notions of segregation. Kimberly, I mean, you ain't wrong. You're not wrong, Kimberly. Looking at the chat, that was birthed out of America, right? The Ku Klux Klan. That's an American byproduct, right? So I don't know how we might want to even be critical of ascribing ourselves to this notion of America, right? to me, I don't mind being excluded from that identity because I don't know personally if that is not in contradiction with my spirit, right? I don't see those two realities being able to reconcile each other with each other. So we'll end it here. For next, let me show you guys what the reading is for next week, and then we'll call it a day. Give me 1 second. I did make an adjustment because we're coming short on time for the semester, and I wanted to kind of go over this reading to help you guys think about your project. So this is a little bit of an abstract text. This is from the literary canon called Afrofuturism or Black speculative literature. And this is from a writer named Octavia Butler. She's like probably the foremost Afrofuturist writers. So here we go. So we'll be reading this text here. It's called The Book of Martha. It's 18 pages, but believe me, it's gonna go really fast. So don't feel like you're overwhelmed. It's literally a narrative, and it moves very quickly. It's definitely a page turner. I'll read you guys a quick excerpt just to kind of give you an idea of what it's about, and then we'll call it a day. Okay, so Martha is the protagonist, and she's engaging in a conversation with God. I'll read this to you, and I'll explain why I chose this as it pertains to your projects. Okay. Okay. Find my spot. Okay. She made herself speak through her fear. You said you had work for me. She paused, licked her lips, tried to steady her voice. What do you want me to do? He didn't answer at once. He looked at her with what she read as amusement. Looked at her long enough to make her even more uncomfortable. What do you want me to do? She repeated, her voice stronger this time. I have a great deal of work for you, he said, at last. As I tell you about it, I want you to keep 3 people in mind, Jonah, Job, and Noah. Remember them. Be guided by their stories. So what God is having her do is to make a change in society that will make society better. One change. She can only change one thing about society in efforts to improve society, right? But God warns her that whatever change that she makes is going to have vast implications. So be very meticulous in how you go about thinking about what change you're going to make. So think about that, read through that as you're thinking about your project with the Constitution, right? And think about the attentiveness that God is forcing Martha to make and the change that she tries to cultivate, and try to apply that attentiveness to your change that you're making to the Constitution, right? So this is kind of a reading that's going to help you think about your final projects, right? Kind of be generative for your production of your final project. Are there any last minute questions or comments you guys have for me? All right. I'll email you guys out the readings. They are already posted on your Google Classroom site. Have a good, safe, healthy weekend, and I will see you guys next week.